Hello and welcome back to Era 7 of the APUS History Curriculum. Today we are going to shift our focus from the domestic scene to foreign policy. Topic 7.11 focuses on the foreign policy of the U.S. between the two world wars. Now, U.S. foreign policy after World War I did see a significant shift from what it had been since the late 1890s back to a period of isolationism. Although at the same time, the U.S. really couldn't be as completely isolationist as they had been in the 19th century. So let's get to it. In the aftermath of World War I, the U.S. was trying to figure out what its proper role in the world should be. On the one hand, they were becoming a world power, pursuing international investments, peace treaties, and selected military interventions to promote their vision of a global order that aligned with American interests. At the same time, the U.S. was slipping back into isolationism, fed up with the entanglements of the Great War. In the election of 1920, Republicans were eager to nominate someone whom they could manage and control. And Warren Harding, a senator from Ohio, represented just such a person. Before his nomination, he had stated, "America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration." He attracted the votes of many Americans who sought a promised return to normalcy, and defeated Governor James Cox of Ohio by the greatest majority in history of the two-party political system, 61% of the popular vote. He focused on a very pro-business agenda. In an effort to protect U.S. agriculture and other businesses, he pushed through the emergency tariff of 1921. A year later, it was the highly protectionist Fordney-McCumber tariff. And then in 1930, President Herbert Hoover continued the trend, signing into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which drove tariff rates up even higher. It had been intended to increase sales of American-made goods in the early months of the Great Depression. But predictably, it angered our foreign trade partners, who in turn raised their tariffs on American imports, thus shrinking international trade and closing additional markets to desperate American manufacturers. Decreasing international trade made it more difficult for other countries to conduct enough trade with the U.S. to pay their own bills. Germany, in particular, found it difficult to make the reparations payments to France and Britain that were required of it by the Versailles Treaty. And France and Britain, dependent on those reparations in order to pay loans that they had obtained from the U.S. during the Great War. The U.S. did develop the Dawes Plan to try and keep this money flowing, but Germany's ability to pay its reparations were hampered by a loss of heavy machinery and industrial equipment, which could have also been used to manufacture war-related supplies, and so the whole system eventually failed. In another example of isolationist foreign policy, Harding aimed to preserve the peace by working together with different nations and lowering the number of weapons globally. Even though the U.S. Senate didn't approve of the Treaty of Versailles, Harding still reached a formal peace with both Germany and Austria. His administration also played a key role in the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 and 22, where they agreed to reduce the naval forces of 9 participating nations. Additionally, the Four-Power Treaty at that same conference, signed by the U.S., Britain, France, and Japan, bound these nations to avoid expanding their territories in Asia. In 1928, the U.S. and 14 other nations, later expanded to 63 total nations, endorsed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which declared war an international crime. This agreement was signed outside of the authority of the League of Nations, so it was impossible to enforce. Despite optimistic expectations that these agreements would promote global peace, they ultimately fell short because none of the nations involved committed to taking action if any of them violated the terms of the treaties. This essentially gave the U.S. a false sense of security regarding the reemergence of militarism and future foreign entanglements. Unfortunately, they fell apart in the 1930s, but in the 20s, people thought that these deals could be a good way to keep the peace. The U.S. also had implemented restrictive immigration policies during the 20s, which we've already looked at, an example being the Immigration Act of 1924, the purpose of which was to insulate the nation from potential external influences and conflicts by limiting the influx of immigrants due to strong anti-European sentiment, which of course was exacerbated by the Red Scare. This had the effect of practically stopping all immigration to the U.S. from Europe and Asia. There were some examples of U.S. interventionism during this time, going into Haiti beginning in 1915 and continuing to occupy it until 1934, emphasizing a strategic interest in protecting U.S. economic assets and maintaining stability in the Caribbean. While this intervention showcased a willingness to use military force, it was carefully tailored to serve very specific objectives, without entangling the U.S. in broader conflicts. The U.S. also conducted military interventions in Nicaragua as part of what were called the Banana Wars. The U.S. even went into Honduras and returned to Cuba in both the 20s and the 30s. These interventions were driven by concerns over political stability, as well as the protection of American interests, including the construction and defense of the Panama Canal. Such interventions, again, were selective and aligned with the broader policy of non-entanglement in European and Asian conflicts. But by the 1930s, isolationism was increasingly difficult to maintain. Fascist and totalitarian governments came to power in both Europe and Asia. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had come to power, supporting fascism, which called for a totalitarian form of government and a heightened focus on national unity, militarism, social Darwinism, and a loyalty to the state. He also believed that military conquest could revitalize a nation and focused on building up the Italian military. In Germany, Adolf Hitler took over as the head of the Nazi Party, embracing ideas of anti-Semitism and scientific racism, which basically was just the idea of the superiority of white-skinned people, and he held particular resentment towards the victorious Allies from World War I. He wanted to establish another German empire and sought to rebuild Germany's military strength, which had been stripped of it by the Versailles Treaty. Japan also saw the rise of a military dictatorship that heavily influenced the emperor, seeking to fiercely defend a capitalist economy and squash communism. Their mutual anti-communist position was the common ground that bound Italy, Germany, and Japan into the military alliance that became the Axis powers. Even Spain, which will remain neutral in the coming conflict, was taken over by Francisco Franco and fascist ideology. And then, of course, you still have Joseph Stalin and communism in the Soviet Union, which was still seeking opportunities to expand their ideology as well. But it isn't just ideology. In 1931, Japan invaded neighboring Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo under false pretenses, and then began a full-scale invasion of China in 1937, during which hundreds of thousands of civilians were massacred. Italy invaded Ethiopia with bombers and tanks in 1935, winning control within a year in order to gain valuable resources and try and boost the Italian economy during the Great Depression. The former German territories of the Saar Valley and the Rhineland were occupied by Nazi troops in 1935 and 36, respectively. In March 1938, Hitler invaded Austria in order to create what he was now calling the Third Reich. He then demanded the German-speaking portion of Czechoslovakia, an area called the Sudetenland. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain suggested that the world should make concessions to the aggressor in this case in order to preserve the overall peace. In September of 1938 at the Munich Conference, the Sudetenland was formally turned over to Germany in exchange for a promise of no further aggression. But 6 months later, all of Czechoslovakia was invaded and taken over by Hitler. By 1939, the Soviet Union, realizing that Poland was likely next, considering it had once been a part of the German Empire, signed a non-aggression treaty with Hitler. And on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, officially beginning World War II. And clearly, as the situation in Europe had begun to deteriorate with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany, the United States tried to keep itself out of what appeared to be an inevitable European conflict. Beginning in 1934, the U.S. Senate Nye Committee began investigating financial and banking interests that had led to the U.S. involvement in World War I, focusing on the munitions industry, the shipbuilding industry, and wartime profits. Their findings resulted in 3 significant pieces of legislation: the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37. These aimed to prevent U.S. involvement in those external conflicts by restricting arms sales and loans to belligerent nations. These legislative measures underscored the commitment to non-entanglement in European and Asian conflict. Essentially, they prohibited the sale of weapons to nations in a state of war, and then prohibited the loans and extension of credit to nations in a state of war. They also prohibited Americans from traveling on vessels belonging to nations at war, in contrast to what had happened in World War I. We don't want another Lusitania. And finally, with the last one, non-military goods would have to be purchased on a cash-and-carry basis, which means countries would have to pay for their goods, usually in gold, and then transport them themselves. But by 1939, these neutrality acts were further changed, and the U.S. was allowing arms to be sold to nations like Britain and France, also on a cash-and-carry basis. After Japan attacked a U.S. gunboat in the Far East, Roosevelt suggested, in what came to be known as the Quarantine Speech, that democracies around the world should quarantine aggressor nations, like Japan, with economic embargoes. His actions were criticized by isolationists, though, who feared that his posturing might lead the U.S. into war, so he backed off and saw it less direct means of addressing this growing totalitarianism in the world. But quickly, the United States began to back away some of its previous treaties that we had signed with Japan, gradually placing an embargo on certain goods, starting with scrap iron and steel in 1940, and eventually oil in August of 1941, which was crucial because 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. After most of Europe had fallen to Nazi occupation, Britain was in dire straits and needed more help. In late 1940, Congress approved a Destroyers for Bases agreement, whereby 50 U.S. Navy destroyers left over from World War I were transferred to Britain and Canada in exchange for naval base rights in the Caribbean, Bermuda, and Newfoundland. This would allow the British to then redeploy troops from those bases to more strategic locations. In addition, Britain was starting to run low on gold to pay for supplies that they needed to fight Germany and Italy. Prime Minister Winston Churchill pleaded with Roosevelt for more help. Sympathetic to the British, but hampered by public opinion and those neutrality acts, Roosevelt eventually came up with the idea of Lend-Lease. During his fireside chat on the radio in December of 1940, he declared the United States to be an arsenal of democracy and suggested that selling weapons to Britain and Canada would be beneficial. Although isolationists still feared that it would entangle the U.S. in another European conflict, over time, public opinion shifted as more Americans recognized the benefits of supporting Britain's war efforts, while still avoiding direct involvement in the hostilities themselves. The use of propaganda showcasing the destruction of British cities during the Blitz and portraying the Germans as ruthless played a crucial role in swaying that public opinion towards the Allies. The Lend-Lease law essentially allowed the U.S. to give the Allies whatever they needed, because their defense was seen as vital to the defense of the United States. Eventually, Lend-Lease shipments would go to the Soviet Union, as well as a multitude of other smaller countries, but Britain got the most. Well, that's what you need to know about Topic 7.11, Interwar Foreign Policy. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.